Oh, brilliant.
Welcome everyone to the ESE department seminar today. We're very fortunate to have a lovely speaker with us today. And I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the ESE seminar committee, Catherine, Valentine, JP, and myself. And today we have Laura Gregory from the University of Leeds, who's come to speak to us. Laura did her bachelor's and master's degrees at the University of Florida and her PhD at Oxford University, working with Richard Walker. For 4 years, she was a postdoc and lecturer at Leeds until 2016, when she was awarded a NERC Independent Research Fellowship, which she is currently at this time. Laura is a very accomplished scientist in studying continental deformation, active tectonics, faults and earthquakes, and specifically, I'm always very interested in her research on cosmogenic isotopes, including some very innovative techniques dating bedrock fault scarps. She's widely published in journals like GRL and EPSL and Nature Scientific Reports, one of my favorite of her papers. And today she's going to be speaking to us about earthquakes in central Italy, quantifying them. And I'd like to welcome Laura to Imperial.
Okay, thank you very much for that welcome and introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to give a seminar at Imperial. Sorry that I'm not actually an Imperial, but this is still pretty good for the current circumstance, so happy to talk to you guys today. Now today I'm going to be talking about earthquakes, and I'm going to take you to central Italy, where you can see a big fault here in this intro slide. And I'm going to show you some examples from both an earthquake that happened recently, a whole sequence of earthquakes actually, and then we're also going to look at the longer term behavior of these faults on multiple earthquake cycles. So they're all active faults. We are talking about kind of how earthquakes work on faults, and but I think we can learn a lot about how faults behave from these kinds of timescales. So that's the scale that I'm interested in. And of course, this work wouldn't be possible without a huge group of people that I'd like to acknowledge in this slide that have really supported me and contributed to what I'm going to show you today in lots of really fantastic ways. So let's jump straight in. Now, when we think about faults and kind of what they do on an earthquake timescale, it would be really nice if they behaved in this very nice model that we see here on the screen. So this is kind of an ideal view of a fault and earthquakes occurring on a fault. Now, if this was the case, we could say that stress on a fault increases up to a certain point, which might be related to the strength of the fault, and then it fails in an earthquake. And over time, it kind of reaches that failure point and goes, and reaches the failure point and goes. And stress is accumulated at a constant rate and it reaches this sort of same threshold. This would be really useful if we were interested in earthquake hazard, because if we knew information about when the last earthquake had occurred, and say we were at some point on this curve, we could say, okay, well, it's probably going to be about, you know, this much time until the next big earthquake happens, and that would be really useful, and, you know, faults would be quite simple. But of course, the real world just isn't like that at all. There's a lot more complexity that we think is happening just on a single fault. So we think that the strength of faults might change over time. Certainly, when an earthquake happens, the fault is quite weak during the event. And at some point, that weakness needs to be regained again in order for stress to accrue. So a fault has to have some strength for stress to accrue. The rate of stress might be variable. We know that faults do things like they recover over a post-seismic period where they do all kinds of weird and wonderful different types of slip at different rates. And we're also starting to see, when we have observations from timescales of kind of longer than an earthquake, you know, a single earthquake cycle, so that's from when the earthquake happens, when the post-seismic period happens, and then stress accumulates, that's one earthquake cycle. But if we look at multiple cycles, we see evidence of behavior like super cycles, where a fault has much more frequent earthquakes than might be expected, kind of given its long-term rate of deformation. And those super cycles might be interspersed with long periods where the fault doesn't have any earthquake. And this behavior is quite weird, and we don't really understand why it happens, but it is really hard to observe. And so trying to get more observations from these kinds of timescales is really important for understanding, you know, why faults might behave this way and for dealing with the hazard that they present. So this is just like what might be happening on one fault. Of course, faults might interact with one another as well, and other things can go on external. So I'm really interested in like what might be controlling some of these behaviors. Anything from, we know that faults do this thing where they are quite, they have patches where they're strong and patches where they're weak, and they might do that over different parts of the earthquake cycle. So they might have slow slip events and stuff like that. And some of that behavior might be related to things like mineralogical changes that are happening on the fault plane itself over a seismic cycle. So these are kind of all the different parts of the systems that might be contributing to some of this weird and wonderful behavior. We know that faults must heal up. We don't understand exactly how or what the timescales of healing might be. If there's you know, really short timescale where they heal up after an earthquake, and then some sort of longer timescale processes that occur to make them strong again. Fluids are obviously really important, so that's definitely contributing to some of this behavior, and things like asperities on the fault might also contribute. So faults, we know, have a kind of rough surface, and the way that roughness seems to control some of the behavior. So these are all the kinds of things that I'm interested in, you know, in the kind of questions that come out of these observations of why faults do what they do. And of course, there's external things. You know, the loading rates of faults are generally fairly constant because it happens over geological time. But how those faults interact on shorter time scales is really interesting, and how that relates to what's going on at depth. So yeah, so in order to really answer all these questions that come out of these observations, we need even more observations. And so I'm not going to answer any of those questions in this talk because they're really hard to answer. But what I do want to show you is what observations we're making in order to try and approach some of those questions. And first, I'm going to take you to an earthquake sequence that occurred in 2016. And this sequence was really interesting because the faults did some very strange things that were somewhat unexpected, including rupturing across two faults that we thought were separate structures. And we saw rupture overlapping and all kinds of things happen. So I'm going to show you what we found about that earthquake sequence. And then we'll talk about cosmogenic isotopes, which some of you guys probably know about, and how we can use cosmogenic isotopes to understand the fault behavior on these slightly longer timescales, and what we are starting to see that they do. And then we'll sort of come back to some of these questions and talk about what it all means, but without any answers because we haven't quite gotten there yet. Okay, so Central Italy is a really good place to go to address these questions. So here we have an active network of faults that are sort of fairly young. They've been active for 2 to 3 million years. They're all normal faults, and I say they're young. They are certainly well developed. So they're at least tens of kilometers long. They can host fairly large earthquakes up to, we think, about a magnitude 7. And they've hosted quite a bit of slip, so on the order of hundreds of meters of slip over their lifetime, up to kilometers. But they're still I don't think they're quite what I would call a mature network of faults. There's still like reorganization that's happening as we're watching. And so they're kind of disconnected, they're anastomosing, there's lots of complexity in the fault structures themselves. And I think that part of that comes from them being relatively young. They haven't had enough time to kind of organize into big, long, through-going structures across the region. So it's really interesting because we've got this sort of, we're capturing this like observation of how faults might grow and interact with each other, at the right time in central Italy. The reason the faults are there is probably related to dynamic topography, so some mantle upwelling underneath that's pushed this area and elevated, and also contributing to extension across the region. So it is extending, even though the kind of alpine collision belt is compressional around it. Now, the thing about these faults, there are loads of them, and the region is extending. So across here, on average, it's extending by about 3 to 4 millimeters per year, which isn't super fast, but we've got a very long network, so that if we took a profile anywhere across the region, that extension rate would be there. And so each fault probably has a rate of slip of 1 millimeter per year or less. And that means that on average, the earthquake recurrence intervals are quite long. So on the timescale of hundreds of years for each individual fault. And so we might expect there to be a reasonably large earthquake every decade or so in this region, but obviously each fault has not had an earthquake, say, in the historical time period, because we haven't had a long enough window of observation. So each of these red lines on here are where we think that faults have had an earthquake in the historical period, and then the black lines are other faults that we also think are active, but maybe haven't had an earthquake. Now, this is what they look like in the field. The Campo Felice fault here, you can see there's a limestone, most of the bedrock here is limestone, and these scarps are really well preserved in the limestone. So we have a rocky footwall and a kind of colluvial hanging wall, and the active fault itself is this white stripe that we can see going across the hillside, and this is what they typically look like. I'll explain a little bit more later about how we think that they are preserved. Another observation that's important about this region is that in the historical time period, so the last 700 years or so, we think that seismicity has mostly been localized on the northeast side of this mountain range, and that is seen in this graph of shaking intensity. So the villages in this region have recorded for hundreds of years when they get shaken or destroyed by an earthquake, and we can map that on to the network as a whole and see that it's sort of skewed and focused on the northeast side. And we might want to first ask ourselves, is that typical? Is it always on the northeast side, or does this kind of migrate around? And so that's an interesting question that comes from that observation. Okay, now we're going to zoom into this box up here. And I should mention, so that's true, that northeast localization is true for the last few earthquakes that have happened. So in 1997, there was an earthquake up here. In 2009, there was one by the town of L'Aquila that you may be familiar with because it caused a lot of damage. And then in 2016, this kind of gap between those two events was filled in. So you might have heard of the Amatrice earthquake that happened in August of 2016. And this event killed almost 300 people, and was very devastating for a relatively low magnitude event, a 6.2. So here I'm just going to show the order of which this sequence of earthquakes evolved over time. And we're doing this because it's a really interesting sequence, and it probably tells us something about what these faults do on kind of earthquake timescales. So the first earthquake was near the town of Amatrice. This view is like an oblique view of the faults in the region. This black line here that you can't see very well behind is the Laga fault, and then there's another fault up here, the Vittore fault, that is important. But so the stars where the earthquake happened, these blue dots and red dots are just aftershocks. And what was kind of interesting is that the the aftershocks migrated northwards. So blue is more is soon after the earthquake, and red is later. And so this aftershock cloud migrated north. And then 2 months later, there was another pair of events, a foreshock and a main shock. The main shock was 6.1. So this sort of jumped a little gap. So here's the previous event, jumped up here to the north onto a different fault. And then 4 days later, there was a magnitude 6.6, which was a very large earthquake for this region, and it filled in this gap. Now, luckily, these last two major events didn't cause many casualties because people had evacuated the region, but it really flattened all the buildings in the area. So there's a lot of damage. And I was sort of unfortunate enough to be in the area when this last earthquake happened, and it's terrifying. The earthquakes that happen in Italy are very shallow, and they cause very strong shaking. So yeah, it's quite important to observe these things in as much detail as we can. So that was what was really good about this earthquake sequence. We had really amazing observations of it, and it's kind of the first time that a large earthquake sequence has happened in a continental region where we have loads of amazing observations from stuff that we were doing on the ground, as well as geodesy, so satellite imagery of how the ground deformed around the event. And so what I want to show you is exactly what happened in these earthquakes using those data sets of the ground deformation using satellite observations. And don't worry too much about the methods for that, but I'm happy to talk a bit about more, but that was done with my colleague Rich Walters at Durham. So we have these satellite images, and then we were also on the ground making observations. We installed some short baseline GNSS, so GPS receivers with really, you can see our setup here is a bit dodgy, but we had a car battery attached to a receiver that we glued onto a rock. And we had installed these after the first earthquake, and so they were still going when the third earthquake happened. We were actually in the area to restart these things up because we had to charge all the batteries. So these things were running during the 6.6. So if you're interested in that, I recommend have a look at Max Wilkinson's paper in Scientific Reports. I won't talk about that data, but it was really cool because we actually saw the earthquake happen. These take an observation every second. And so we were able to kind of observe the offset of the fault in GPS, which is really cool. And then we also did a lot of terrestrial laser scanning of the surface ruptures themselves to sort of see how the ground deformed during the earthquake and then in the following days. But again, I probably won't talk too much about that. But yeah, there's another paper by Luke Wedmore, my postdoc at the time, on that, some of those observations. So that was really good. Now, this is a map of the Mount Vittore, which is that northern part of the earthquake sequence. You see high mountain topography. All of these lines are different ruptures. So in places, the surface rupture overlapped from two earthquakes. So this was the Amatrice, the first one, and the last one overlapped where it's red. And then there was lots of surface rupture produced by the magnitude 6.6. Including a lot of rupture that was actually antithetic. So this rupture here points in towards the main fault structure. And then you can see all the kind of observations that we got on the ground in this image. But the map of the surface ruptures is much better presented than this figure in a paper that we worked on with the Italian Geological Survey and the Emergia group, which is a big collaboration between Italian and European scientists to try and map all of these ruptures, because there was over 40 kilometers of surface rupture produced by just the 6.6. So if you're interested, have a look at that paper. And so what I want to show you is a kind of combination of those observations of what the surface rupture looked like in the field, because it was really complex, and what we could observe using satellite radar data. And I'm going to show you a series of kind of observations of each earthquake and talk about what we've learned from those different events. And so you'll see a map of all the faults that we've kind of modeled that were involved. And they're a simple model because they're, a simple rectangle. But for a geodetic model, this is quite complex. So we're only pushing it as far as we think our data are good enough. And so these are fine for these kind of rectangular faults are totally fine for the resolution of the data, and it gives us a sense of what happens. And so I'll show you, this is like a side view, so looking at depth and a long strike. This is the Laura Fault here on the right, this main structure, which is on this map down in the south. That's where the Amatrice earthquake happened. And then this is the Leary Fault. And all of these other structures are kind of associated with the Leary Fault further to the north. And you can see them simple in this map view, how they kind of approximate where the surface rupture is. So I'm going to show you a series of that. But first, let's look at what it actually looked like in the field, because that's fun. Lots of us are field geologists. The first earthquake did produce a surface rupture, which is this little crack running along the fault in this small valley of a few 10 to 20 centimeters, and it wasn't very long rupture. It's limited to where we have bedrock limestone. But of course, the earthquake at depth happened over a much larger area. So that surface rupture is in this northern part. So north is this way, south is this way on this map. That's where it reached the surface, but we know that it actually ruptured at depth along the northern end of this Laura Fault down here and along the southern end of the Leary Fault. And also the pattern of deformation in this earthquake means that there was slip in this area in between those two faults. And that was just really surprising to us because normally when we think about these fault structures, we think of them having an earthquake on a fault. And you know, the size of that fault tells us how big the earthquake could be. So if you have a fault that is a certain, tens of kilometers long, we might expect it at most has a mid-magnitude 6 or something like that. But here, this actually ruptured across two faults, and what we thought was a gap between those structures. But the fact that there was a significant amount of deformation in that gap means that there is a structure at depth there. So this is really interesting because I think we've kind of seen fault linkage, major structure fault linkage in action in this first earthquake. So there was kind of a pulse of slip on these two faults. Now we don't know if they're really actually hard linked at depth. It'd be really cool to get kind of subsurface data to be able to image that. But certainly they can work together to host deformation. So whether that's accomplished by some sort of relay zone or whether these faults are actually longer at depth than we think they are really interesting questions. So I thought that was quite an interesting observation. Now the next earthquake kind of was a little bit confusing. So this outline here is the slip that happened in that first event, and then the second one went to the north, and it really left this really big gap in between the two faults. So it's up here on the northern end of the Leary Fault, and yeah, it's a kind of interesting pattern of slip at depth. And this is pretty well resolved by our modeling, this kind of finger of slip that went in the direction of the next event. And so that event really filled in that gap. And it's interesting because that gap wasn't, huge. It wasn't a big strand of fault that needed to rupture, but it really had a lot of slip at depth. And so that was a big earthquake. And some of that slip, you can see it overlapped with the earthquake that had happened 4 days before. And we saw it overlap at the surface as well. And it overlapped with the earthquake that had happened 2 months before. So it's interesting to make that observation that even though this fault had slipped either 2 months or a few days before, it could still slip again. And so it's definitely, it's healed up enough to be able to accumulate more slip. But it probably was very easy to rupture through because it wasn't super strong. It had only been a couple of months since the last earthquake, so not a lot of stress had accumulated. So that's kind of an interesting way to think about what we can learn from that rupture. The observations of the surface were really surprising and pretty amazing to see in action. So here you can see slip. This is on like a bedrock fault scarp, and you can see the ground moved down by about 20 centimeters here. And we drew some paint marks on that rupture just to record where it was after the first earthquake. And now you can see our paint pen marks after the 6.6 are just, almost 2 meters above where they were the day before. So that was pretty crazy to walk out here and see this big rupture at the surface. And you can see that this part of the fault plane is still covered in mud because it hadn't rained yet. This was maybe the day or two after the earthquake when we took this photo. So the 6.6 made a much bigger offset, of course, because it's a huge amount of energy compared to a 6.2. This is what it looked like from a little bit far away. So that's a very nice continuous ground rupture at the surface, and you can see in this photo, so that's me and my PhD student, Hugh, who got to experience an earthquake about a week after he started his PhD. And then this is a photo looking along that rupture in the field. And we can see here that the kind of preserved longer term bedrock scarp is also obvious at this spot. So that's kind of what it looked like. And it was very reassuring that big earthquakes do create this, this nice scarp in the bedrock fault that's very continuous and with a consistent offset. So yeah, if we kind of bring together all of those 2D maps that I showed you, we can make a picture of all the faults in the area. And they're really complex, and I didn't really mention this, but one of the things we had to do was have some oblique and antithetic faults in there to explain the deformation that we saw. And those oblique faults, we think, probably played a big role in kind of partitioning the rupture on the main structures. So it's just a nice GIF, and that's a little antithetic fault that was quite shallow that we could also observe. So yeah, if we kind of step back and say, well, what have we learned? We think some of those cross-cutting faults, so this is the cross-cutting fault here. You can see there's quite a lot of slip on that in the 6.6 earthquake. So this is the 6.2, the 6.1, the 6.6. We think this cross-cutting fault might have actually stopped the first earthquake and played a big role in stopping the rupture. And then we think that the last earthquake was able to kind of rupture through that barrier because it had recently, been quite stressed by the first earthquake. So a very complicated network of faults, and so trying to understand what these faults look like at depth is really important, and certainly a question that I've talked to Chris Jackson a lot about in the past. And so yeah, there's lots of interesting questions there. What was kind of interesting about this, I mentioned at the beginning the aftershocks and how they kind of moved to the south and then started moving north. And what we see is if we plot the pattern of those aftershocks over time, so going from green to purple in time on the fault plane itself, they kind of slowly moved along at a rate that we think is consistent with kind of fluids migrating in the crust. And so we think that there might have been a kind of progression of like a fluid wave that almost, when it reached this point that was, ready to have an earthquake, it went. And so fluids probably were really important, and how those fluids diffused through the crust were important. Why they didn't trigger an earthquake here, we don't know. We hypothesized that they sort of moved along some of the cross-cutting structures and skipped over this gap. But yeah, that's just pure speculation. But yeah, so that's kind of a nice clue to what happened in the earthquake. Okay, so that is, all the observations we can get from one event, and we can get a sense of how complicated these faults are. But what can we learn about what they do on kind of longer time scales? So this is just one earthquake, but we actually have a record of lots of earthquakes that have built up fault scarps like this one. This isn't a very good one. It's very eroded, but yeah, we can use this to kind of study what these faults do on longer time scales. So switching gears a little bit, what we think is happening in this area, we need to start thinking about climate change and ask how these scarps are actually preserved. So I showed you a picture, but this is a kind of simple model of maybe not so simple, where we have a fault that is being exhumed. Get that video to play again. Yeah, and the hill slope erosion rate is quite fast. And so if we have a fast erosion rate that kind of matches or is faster than the fault slip rate, we develop a nice smooth planar hill slope. And we think in this region that this setup of fast erosion rate and normal slip rate was there during the LGM, the last glacial maximum. And so the last glacial maximum in this area lasts until about 10 to 20,000 years ago. And so before that time period, we weren't really preserving any nice fault scarps. Now, if we reduce the hill slope erosion rates, we actually find that we can create quite a nice planar fault scarp that doesn't get eroded away. And so our hypothesis is that as erosion rates slow down during global climate change from cool to warmer events, you get less freeze-thaw action on the hill slopes, and the scarps themselves are able to be preserved. So if we look at this image, we can see the nice part of the scarp that's been preserved during the time period since the last glacial maximum ended, and then above that, things that were eroded during time. So I'll show you a few more pictures of that shows it a little bit better. So if you imagine our footwall is being driven up by fault slip, and this part of the footwall that was exposed during the LGM is nice and smooth and planar and eroded, and then since the demise of the LGM, we've been able to get these nice, well, pretty nice planar scarps. Obviously, they're not perfect, so some processes are still acting here, but we can find nice areas to look at. And you can see this really well on this photo here too. We have the rocky footwall slope and then this more preserved bedrock scarp. And so our idea is that all of the offset that has occurred from about this point to the contact with the hanging wall has accumulated over the time period since the demise of the last glacial maximum. So that's around 10 to 20,000 years. It's pretty wide length of time that might kind of occur over. Yeah. So, and we see this really nicely on the Leary Fault, where the 2016 earthquake happened. You can see this nice planar footwall and then a big scarp and then a smooth planar hanging wall. And, you know, it's quite, you have to be very careful about where you decide to make these measurements because we don't want to kind of have any other hill slope processes that are contributing to the formation of this scarp. Okay, so we've got a scarp. It's been exposed over the last 10 to 20,000 years, and we can use cosmogenic isotopes to measure the rate at which that fault plane has been exposed. So if you don't know, cosmogenic isotopes are produced by the kind of constant radiation that we're receiving from cosmic particles. They interact with various isotopes in bedrock and create isotopes that are not naturally found on Earth. So in the case of limestone, we have plenty of chlorine available in limestone, and naturally we can find chlorine 35 and chlorine 37, but we shouldn't find any chlorine 36 on Earth. It doesn't form kind of naturally. If we were to like take some table salt, it should have mostly just 35 and 37. But as calcium, sorry, most of the production actually comes from calcium, not chlorine. But if we have, which is why we use limestone. But yeah, so if we have a calcium atom and it's bombarded by one of these particles, it produces chlorine 36. And so we can use the concentration of chlorine 36 found in these scarps to measure how the scarps have been exposed to this radiation. And the reason we can do that is because when we get deep enough away from the Earth's surface, the radiation attenuates and we shouldn't see any chlorine being produced. And so it only really starts to become produced when the fault is very close to the Earth's surface. And so that tells us something about what's going on. And I'll show you some plots that will clarify that in a second. But so yeah, we go to the field, we find a nice stable sampling site that looks like the hanging wall hasn't been eroded away and nothing weird is happening on the footwall. And we dig a little trench because these samples have been exposed to cosmic radiation, and we collect samples in a kind of discrete ladder up the fault scarp, often by hanging off a rope, and yeah, it's quite fun fieldwork. As I said, where we actually choose to sample is really important. So we do a lot of collection of data like terrestrial laser scanning to make high resolution picture of our sample sites. And so here you can see that footwall slope, the lower hanging wall slope, and this ridge here is our fault scarp at the Frattura site. And so we wouldn't want to sample here next to this gully in the footwall because this material has been affected by some erosion, whereas we've got a fairly constant contact with the footwall and the hanging wall. And so we can be a little bit more confident that the material hasn't been removed. And so the exposure of this fault scarp itself is only due to earthquakes and not some sort of other hill slope process. So like here you can see the scarp is a lot bigger in an area where there's a drainage channel below. And so some of the exposure here is due to drainage processes and not due to earthquakes. Whereas here the scarp is a bit lower, and we've got a nice flat contact here. That's a better place to sample. So we go around and we find a good place to sample, we collect the rocks. They're processed in our lab in Leeds to extract chlorine. So we're here working in red light because we use silver chloride to extract the chlorine from our crushed up and dissolved rocks, and that stuff is sensitive to light, so I get to work in the dark basically. And we go from a rock sample to a tiny plug of silver chloride sample. It gets run on an accelerator, mass spectrometer up in East Kilbride. So that whole process I actually tweeted last year when I processed a batch of samples. So if you check out my Twitter at the earthquakes and search back for #CosmoLive, you can see lots of videos of me doing stuff in the lab if you're interested in what we do, because I tried to live tweet the process, which was quite fun. Yeah, so we take those, we collect all of these samples and we measure them, and then we want to measure the concentration of chlorine-36 in the sample. And what we should expect to see, so this is just a simple model of what we should expect to see. So we've got chlorine-36 concentration on the x-axis here and height up the fault on this axis here. And if we look at our sample concentrations as we go from the base up, we should see an increase in concentration. And that's because at the top of the fault up here, this has been exposed much longer than at the base. This has probably been exposed in a much more recent earthquake. And so it's got a lower chlorine concentration because it hasn't been exposed to cosmic radiation for so long. And down at depth, the production of chlorine-36 decreases exponentially. And so we can see that that is reflected in the concentration of the isotope as well. So as we get closer to depths greater than 2 or 3 meters, we should see very low chlorine concentrations because they've been shielded by the overlaying colluvium. And as that fault scarp is brought up, we should see an increase in the concentration. Now, for faults that are moving really, really quickly, so have a very fast slip rate of say 3 millimeters per year, we would expect that curve to be quite steep. And that's because for the same height, say 2 meters on a fault scarp, that's been exposed for much less time than a fault that's moving really slowly at less than or at a quarter of a millimeter per year. That same height of a fault that's moving slowly will have been exposed for much longer because it's sort of come out of the ground very, very slowly, whereas a fast fault has come out rapidly. And so we can see just a simple relationship in order to get the just rate of slip on a fault just by sort of plotting up our data on this type of graph. So when we do that with all of our data from across Italy, or most of our data from across Italy, we see that's the case. We have faults that move at quite fast rates, and so they're plotting over here on the left side of this graph, and we have some faults that move much more slowly. They have much higher concentrations of chlorine-36 than the faults that are moving more quickly. So that's cool, that's a great observation. We can see that there are lots of faults that are moving at different rates, but it's not very surprising. And so what we might want to do is try and develop a better history from the data. We don't just want to say how fast they're moving. Now this gets quite complicated. So originally people started trying to model the exhumation of these faults using kind of earthquakes. And so they say, okay, well, if an earthquake happens, what chlorine concentration would I expect to get? And so if another earthquake was to happen, maybe I'd get this pattern and this pattern, this pattern. And what you see here are these little cusps, and that cusp is sort of developed while the fault scarp was partially buried below the ground surface, and then it's been exhumed up. And so if we had a perfect world where we were getting earthquakes every 2,000 years, and each earthquake moved the fault by 2 meters, we could probably actually see this pattern of like repeating earthquakes over time. And so this right here, this plot is a forward model. So we've just said, well, here's a hypothetical earthquake history. What chlorine would I expect to get? This is what I would get if that was actually happening. But if we look at our data, it's actually really hard to find those little cusps. Maybe you can see hints of them, but they're not very well defined, and of course the data are noisy and there's lots of uncertainties. So our group has sort of moved away from, well, we never really tried to actually model individual earthquakes, and instead we try and we've developed basically a modeling code that just tests for changes in rate of slip. So I hinted at before at the beginning of the talk that these faults experience clusters or supercycles of earthquakes. And what we want to do is try and observe when a fault was moving more quickly versus when it was slow over time. And so our code is really focused on trying to discern that rather than kind of individual events. And so what we do is we take the forward model, so what, we give it a exhumation history and we say what chlorine would we get. So we model that. So this is based on just a proposed history of slip, and these black dots here are our measurement, and we compare the modeled to the measured. So this is just one. Obviously this doesn't fit very well, and we include everything like the characteristics of the site. So the elevation and latitude are really important for how fast chlorine is produced, and things like the chemistry in the sample is important. So how much calcium is in the sample affects how much chlorine that we measure. So we've basically developed a Bayesian statistical Markov chain Monte Carlo code, which is a fancy way of saying I want a computer to propose lots and lots of different exhumation histories. I want to compare the chlorine that would result from all of those exhumation histories, and I want to do it in a statistical way because I do know some things about these faults that I can say, tell the code to take into account, and then I want to see, well, what fits the data best and what is the kind of most reasonable history of exhumation given what we know about what's happened to these fault scarps. So we propose a slip history. So I'm going to put up a few graphs that look like this, where we've got time and slip. So these graphs, just to get your eye in, this is in the past over here, this top corner, and this is most recent today. So time is today is here and time goes in this direction. And so here we'd have a fault that was moving slowly. And so the top half of the fault here was exposed back at this time, and then it moved more quickly. And then it has a long-ish period, what we call the elapsed time. So that's the time since the last earthquake. And so that's one just example of a fairly simple slip history. And you see there's like these stairs here. And we're not trying to measure any of these as individual earthquakes. We're just saying, well, there was a period of time where it was having earthquakes at a given rate. And so the stairs don't really matter in our code. It's just the way that we've had to write it. So we would compare that profile to the measured data. We say, oh, that doesn't fit very well. And then we decide whether we want to accept that as something that is good enough or propose a new slip history by changing some of the parameters that went into this one. So if the fit is better than the previous model it tries, it always accepts that model. And then if it's worse, it sometimes accepts it because sometimes we don't want to kind of get stuck in like a little hole in our model. And what we get is something that looks like this. So here we're on, again, time versus slip. And so this is the range of exposure histories that we think might be possible for our data. And this is just a synthetic model that I did. So the red line is the actual model that I used to generate the chlorine-36 data. And then this gray one is what the code proposed, and it's pretty good. But we see there's a range. And we do put quite a wide range on our acceptable models because there are a lot of other uncertainties besides the analytical errors on each data point here. If you want to use this code, you can go to GitHub, Laura Gregory /simple slips is what I've called it because it's one of the more simple versions of these modeling codes. There are quite a few out there, and you can see. Okay, so we're getting close to running out of time, so I'll quickly show you some results. So we've got all of these different sites across Italy, and we want to question, well, is the rate of fault slip constant on these faults, or is it variable through time? And try and understand how these faults are interacting. So I'll zoom into the central part of the region. You can see here our data from several different sites across here. There's L'Aquila, and so these are lots of other active faults that haven't had earthquakes in historical time periods. And we're going to focus on results from Capurciano and Asurgi. So Capurciano, this is just what we kind of look for here. This is our fit to the data on the left. So red and blue are different models, and this is the slip history on the right. So I'll show a few plots that look like this. And we always see if things like a constant rate fit the data, just to make sure that we're not over-interpreting our data. And here you can see it doesn't fit very well, whereas this kind of long elapsed time on the Capurciano fault with rapid slip around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago and kind of probably slip in the past fits the data quite well. So we model everything up to the demise of the last glacial maximum. And you can see here, this is the kind of range of fits of all of our different models. So it's not perfect, which is why you see it's important not to overinterpret these data. And so we really take a kind of range and look at average slip rates over time. Asurgi is, it's a bit different. It's a very noisy data set. And so we struggle to get a model that fits really well. And you can see there's not that big of a difference in the fit between a constant rate model and what we came up with as our most likely model, but there's a huge difference in what those actually are. And so the data are good, but they don't tell us everything. And so we do need to be careful and say, well, like, is this actually okay to just say it's moving at a constant rate? Well, it doesn't fit these top samples very well, so maybe it's bad to say it's a constant rate. But those are the things that we ask ourselves. And yeah, like this part of the scarp is really poorly constrained at the time, because we know how tall these scarps are, but we can't collect samples all the way to the top because they're a bit eroded at the top. And so this is not very well constrained. See, our samples are only collected up to here. So yeah, good to consider that. Okay, so to get to the answer of what they're doing, we calculate a fault slip rate. So we take all of those models and average a slip rate over time. And so time going back, rate of slip. So this particular example had a peak slip rate around 500 to 1,500 years ago. This is the Leary Fault, and then slowed down. So what we want to do is compare across this whole region. And what I've done on this left plot here is, and it's quite funny because there's a lot of data that's gone into this single plot, but you can see the rate of slip across individual faults in colors, and so the colors match up with this plot over here. So we have pink in Asurgi, and Asurgi is this fault here. And what's interesting is that, for one thing, the summed extension rate across all these faults kind of averages out almost to the geodetic rate. Now, I've probably got too many faults in that sum because you can see all the faults aren't overlapping. So I would expect the cumulative rate of extension across this region to be a little bit high. So I'm really happy with that. That's pretty good. Sometimes it's really hard to compare rates of deformation on these different timescales. And so you can see that ends up right. That's okay. I'm happy with that. But what's really interesting is we can see that there are kind of peaks in slip rate across these different faults. So Capurciano, Roccabatura, and Campo Felice seem to have peaks at different times. And that's really cool. It suggests that they're kind of sharing the strain across this volume of rock here, and interacting in a really strong way. And then some of the faults are just fairly constant through time, and then they drop off. And so yeah, there's loads of really interesting observations in here that we're still sort of trying to work on how to explain. And yeah, just a point to make, I mean, that's the extension rate, which is what we think about when we have a geodetic rate of deformation. But actually, if we resolve the slip onto the plane of the fault, it's much higher. So, and that slip on the plane of fault is more directly related to the moment release that we would expect in an earthquake. So just because we say the region is extending by 3 to 4 millimeters per year, actually the moment release rate is higher than what we would expect for that just extension rate. It's important to think about these things in 3D. And yeah, if we look across all the transects, we see similar types of behavior arising, where sharing of strain across lots and lots of different faults. And so I'm happy to talk about that in more detail if you want after the talk. I know I'm talking to a few people this afternoon, but I can always chat more if you're interested. Okay, so this thing, slip rate variability, I've just shown you that it occurs. How well can we constrain it though? So my PhD student Hugh has just done a study where we looked at lots of sites along strike on the same fault, and they kind of have a similar exposure history. That's just been accepted with minor corrections in tectonics, so have a look at that. So yeah, we can constrain it quite well. So it's lots of different sites on the same fault have a similar exhumation history, but not exactly the same. So again, it's important to consider what these data are actually telling us. We know that faults have deformation around the fault. So this was our terrestrial laser scanning study where we can see that deformation is kind of, the fault runs through here, and we see a kind of complicated pattern of deformation around the single earthquake that sometimes occurs off the fault. And these structures are super complex. So, you know, how much of this slip are we missing by just looking at these fault scarps up here is a good question to also think about. Yeah, and why does it vary? So I'm just going to finish it now, sorry. So all of these things that I talked about at the beginning of the talk, we're starting to think about, you know, what's actually happening on the fault structure itself, what happens in the microstructures. We see evidence for lots of different types of deformation in fault microstructures, and including things that suggest that faults deform, you know, the deformation of the mineralogy is both fast and slow, even in a brittle setting. So that's what's coming next. So yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and I hope I haven't gone too fast or covered too much, but these are the kind of things that we've learned as a result of this work so far. So I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. That was an excellent talk. Really appreciate that. So we have a couple of questions coming here, and you're probably not going to be surprised by who they're coming from. Chris Jackson has some has a series of questions, in fact. So the first one that he asked was, how do your slip rates compare to global slip rates for normal faults? Are your faults faster or slower than the average? And what might this say for the processes driving stress buildup or frictional strength of these rocks in particular?
Oh, that's a really good question. I haven't really thought about that too much. Actually, I have been like thinking about that in the last few days, because I was thinking about why do we see often faster slip rates on longer faults? So yeah, so these faults, I think, in terms of their length and the level of activity that we know is happening, so like the overall deformation rate, are totally normal and reasonable. They're kind of what I would expect. So I would expect that if we had a region that is deforming by 3 to 4 millimeters per year, if you distribute that across all the faults, you would get the kind of rates of between 1/4 to 1 millimeter per year. So that some of the preliminary work that I've been doing in Turkey on faults that are much older and often quite a lot longer and bigger, they're, you know, I was surprised they're not actually slipping that much faster. And so I think there is a good discussion to be had over whether, yeah, the faults kind of reach a peak rate of like 1 millimeter per year, and then they can't go any faster because it's being sort of shared across all the other faults. So yeah, that's a really good question. I'd love to talk about that more, actually. Yeah, so in short, I think they're pretty standard, and I think that there's nothing to make me think that they're any more or less strong than other normal faults in the world. But then we do know, so if you look to like some of the really big normal faults in China, they're capable of hosting much larger earthquakes. So like up to magnitude 8 on a normal fault, which is very rare that you see a normal fault that can make a magnitude 8. And that suggests those faults are stronger, but I'm not sure that they move at a faster average slip rate. So that's something I would definitely like to look at. Yeah, good question.
Well, so he actually had a follow-up question to that, and then a follow-up question to that. And I'll try to kind of to join them. So basically, the question he asked was, how might your selection of sample site impact the slip rates you calculate for individual faults and subsequent interpretation of kinematic interactions between faults? And then he basically kind of followed that up with a comment saying that you may have answered part of that question with Hughes data, although his follow-up question then relates to whether those samples were on the main segment or on relays.
Oh yeah, so that's really cool. So normally when we're picking a sample site, if we say just want one sample site per fault, we'd always pick it to be as close to the middle of the fault as we could get, because that is where you would expect the kind of maximum slip rate. But in Hugh's study, I don't think I have the figures in this talk. That's annoying. Yeah, sorry. Basically, in Hugh's paper that's coming out, we did sample one site that was a cross strike in a relay. And so we had a site that was kind of located in this area of the fault where there was another fault overlapping in map view. And then we have a site in the middle of the fault. And the site at the spot that's overlapping, the rate is way less. So it's a slower rate of slip. The scarp height is lower, so we know it slipped slower over the Holocene. But the changes in rate occurred at the same time. And so that suggests that in each earthquake, that site is still kind of experiencing slip in most of the earthquakes that are happening on that fault, but not as much slip as at the center of the fault. And so we hypothesize that the strain is being shared across the relay between two structures. And so where you're in the relay, you get a lower rate, but you still see these kind of changes in slip rate at the same time. So yeah, that was really cool. And I'd love to do more of that. And I've got a few places in Turkey where we've sort of sampled that might tell us something more about that process once we have data. So yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so the next question comes from Alex Whitaker, who says, cool talk. Can you find particular faults where periods of fast slip are explicitly balanced by slow slip on other fault segments that are a cross strike? How wide a zone faulting do you need to get the regional average in terms of extension rate? And any idea how some faults seem to have a highly variable rate and others do not?
Yeah, there's loads of questions in there. Yeah, so in short, yes, I think we can see places where the faults are sort of like almost switching back and forth between across strike structures. And so I think if you kind of overinterpret Capurciano, Roccafortura, and Campo Felice as overlapping, and Campo Felice might actually be part of a longer system here, that these three faults overlapping sort of seem to be interacting, where like Campo Felice had a fast period of slip, and then Capurciano, Roccafortura, Campo Felice. It's not exactly what we would predict from stress modeling, because if you modeled the stress of an earthquake on the Capurciano fault, it would actually inhibit stress across strike, and it should trigger stress along strike. So that doesn't really fit with that explanation. So yeah, I mean, why these faults have these periods where they have multiple, because this peak is multiple earthquakes, right? So one of my ideas is that you have a period where the fault has a lot of earthquakes, and then it kind of just like can't go anymore, it's done. And so then this fault across strike has been building up stress for a long time, and it's probably quite strong because it hadn't had an earthquake for a long time, and then it's ready to go and take up that regional strain. Yeah, so that is, I think there is evidence for that, and for also some along strike variability maybe. I mean, not all the faults do that, and conveniently I haven't colored these lines on this plot, so I can't really tell you more about the other areas. But for sure in some of the work we've been doing down here, so this Leary Fault here, it was active at the same time as several of these other faults here that we have from a previous study. And we think that, like, on a very large scale, the activity in the historical period has been localized up here. And then before that, there's a lot of activity down here in the southwest. So I've just resubmitted a paper to geology that goes through the Leary Fault, because the time at which the Leary Fault was active, which is this green line here, at this time period, there's a lot of strong shaking in Rome, actually. And so it makes sense that all these faults on here were doing a lot when Rome was experiencing loads of earthquakes. So yeah, I think that's an example of that there. What was the next question?
Let's see.
He also asked,
how wide a zone of faulting do you need to get to the regional average in terms of extension rate?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like these faults can actually host the entire region extension rate on one fault for periods of time. So like sometimes they get up to 2 to 3 millimeters per year just on a single fault for a short period of time. And so it depends on what time scale you're talking about. So if it's like 1,000 years, you can do it on just one fault. Whereas if it's longer time scales, you need more faults to do it. And why it does localize so much is the big question that we're thinking about right now.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Laura. That was so lovely to have you, and thank you for joining us in these strange circumstances. It was really a pleasure. And I just want to remind everyone that next week we have another exciting talk by Paula Kohlmeyer called Imaging Light Structures at Earth's Core Mantle Boundary in Heavy Detail. And it should be another very exciting seminar. So I look forward to seeing you then.
Great, thank you.